There was a time when dinner wasn't planned around a recipe blog or a grocery store sale flyer. It was planned around what was left, what was cheap, and how many mouths needed feeding before sunrise the next morning. If you grew up in a working-class home in the 1970s, or if your parents did, you already know the smell I'm talking about. Something heavy and warm on the back burner. Steam on the kitchen window. The sound of a skillet going before anyone had even taken off their coat. These were meals built around $3 of meat in a nearly empty pantry, and they filled you up every single time. A lot of them have quietly disappeared from dinner tables. Not because they weren't good, but because the world moved on, supermarkets got bigger, and somehow we stopped making the things that used to matter most. Tonight, we're bringing them back. Every last one of them. Ham hocks and cabbage. You could smell ham hocks and cabbage from 2 houses down. That low, smoky, rich smell that meant someone had the sense to start the pot early. Ham hocks were dirt cheap, and a head of cabbage cost almost nothing. But together, slow-cooked over several hours on a low flame, they produced something that felt like it cost a lot more. The hock would soften until the meat slid off the bone with the lightest push of a spoon. The cabbage soaked up all that smoky, porky broth until it turned tender and deep with flavor. No measuring cups were involved. No cookbook sat open on the counter. You threw everything in, added water, maybe a pinch of black pepper, and let time do the rest. Families stretched this across 2 or 3 days. Sometimes beans went in on the second night, sometimes just more water and a little salt. It still worked. If there was bread, you dunked it. If there wasn't, you drank the broth straight from a bowl. It warmed you from the inside out and gave you just enough to face the next cold morning. Braised rabbit with root vegetables. And just when you think it could not get more resourceful, consider that some families were braising rabbits in cast iron and doing it with what they caught in their own backyard. Back when meat was a luxury, rabbits were a working man's protein. Lean, available, and often running around just past the tree line. You would see folks come back from a morning hunt with 1 or 2, skin them in minutes, and get the pot going before noon. The meat got a quick sear, and then a long, slow-soaking broth with whatever root vegetables the garden could spare. Carrots, turnips, onions if you had them. A little rosemary if someone had planted it out back. The pot stayed warm on the stove, and anyone passing through got a bowl. That was the unspoken rule. This dish faded when people left rural life behind and moved into factory towns and city apartments where there was no yard and no woods. But for the people who grew up with it, braised rabbit carried real weight. It was the kind of meal that reminded you how tough and tender things could be at the same time. Pickled pig's feet. Now for something a little more vinegary, a little more jiggly, and considerably more polarizing. You either loved pickled pig's feet or you looked the other way and kept walking. They sat in glass jars, clear as day, on the corner of a dusty bar or on a neighbor's kitchen shelf. Inside, the feet soaked in vinegar, garlic, and spices for days, sometimes the better part of a week. Once they hit a plate, they came alongside boiled potatoes, plain and simple. Nobody was pretending this was elegant food, but it was real. Collagen-heavy, rich, tangy, and quietly satisfying in a way that surprised first-timers. The potatoes mellowed out the sharpness of the vinegar, and together they made a pairing that was oddly comforting. This was food with working-class pride built into every bite. It didn't care what you thought of it. It just showed up, filled the plate, and did its job. Cold Meatloaf Sandwiches. Some folks preferred to keep things a little more straightforward the next day. A slab of cold meatloaf between 2 slices of soft white bread was the blue-collar lunchbox staple that needed no introduction. You made meatloaf on a Monday night, and by Tuesday morning, it was sandwich material without any effort at all. A squeeze of yellow mustard, 2 slices of bread, and that was it. The fat in the loaf firmed up overnight in the refrigerator, the seasoning settled, and the mustard cut right through it with a sharp little reminder of flavor. You could eat it at the kitchen table, in the cab of a truck, or straight from a lunch pail on a job site. Kids loved it. Adults depended on it. Some added a pickle. Others put on a slice of raw onion. The base never changed. Humble, dependable, and somehow always better the second day than it was the first. Did your house do it with mustard, or did someone always insist on ketchup instead? Chicken livers with onions and bell peppers. You knew this was cooking the second the sizzle hit the pan. Chicken livers, diced onions, and chopped bell peppers in a hot skillet together was a sound and a smell that meant real food was coming. Livers were packed with iron, protein, and deep, rich flavor, but they cost almost nothing because most people at the grocery store walked right past them. The rice stretched the meal to feed everyone at the table. The onions and peppers gave it sweetness and texture, and the whole thing came together in under 30 minutes on a single burner. Some folks added garlic. Others kept a bottle of hot sauce nearby. Every bite was rich without being heavy. It filled you up, kept you going through the afternoon, and left enough for tomorrow's lunch. This was the kind of cooking that made the most out of the least, and for families watching every dollar, that was not a small thing. Stuffed bell peppers. And if you thought that was clever, consider what 1 pound of ground beef and a handful of rice could accomplish inside a hollowed-out bell pepper. Stuffed bell peppers looked like more work than they were, and they fed 5 or 6 people from what seemed like almost nothing. You browned the beef, mixed in cooked rice, added a spoonful of tomato paste, maybe some dried herbs, and packed the mixture into the peppers like little edible containers. Into the oven they went, surrounded by whatever sauce you could assemble from pantry scraps. Tomato, broth, water with seasoning. Each pepper gave you meat, starch, and vegetable all in one. No side dish required. Some families topped them with breadcrumbs or a little cheese if there was any to spare. Others loaded in extra chopped vegetables to bulk up the filling. The point was always the same. Feed everyone, stretch the budget, and make it look like you were not stretching at all. It was budget cooking that had the manners to look presentable. Oxtail Stew. When meat was scarce, the cuts that got overlooked by everyone else became the most valuable things in the kitchen. Oxtail was one of those. Once considered little more than scraps, it became the foundation of slow-cooked meals that delivered more flavor per dollar than almost anything else in the butcher case. You started by browning the pieces in a big pot, bone and fat together, until the kitchen filled with that deep, savory smell that draws people in without invitation. Then came the onions, garlic, chopped carrots, and barley, all added to the mix. Broth or water went in next, and then you waited. Hours, usually, but the result earned every minute. The meat loosened and pulled away from the bone in soft, tender ribbons. The broth thickened from the marrow and turned silky. The barley added weight and body, and the carrots gave it a quiet sweetness that balanced everything out. This was not just soup. It was sustenance. You needed nothing else besides a spoon and a piece of crusty bread to scrape the bowl. And it always tasted better reheated the next day with a splash of water stirred in. Breaded veal cutlets. When the weekend called for something that felt a little fancier, some families pulled out a shallow pan, some breadcrumbs, and a thin piece of veal, and made dinner feel like payday even when it wasn't quite. Breaded veal cutlets were thin, golden, and crispy. You took a cheap veal slice, dipped it in flour, then egg, then breadcrumbs, and laid it gently in a hot skillet. It sizzled on contact. The crust formed fast while the inside stayed tender. Each bite had crunch and flavor and a kind of effort that came through even though the whole process took under 15 minutes. Beside on the plate, a scoop of instant mashed potatoes, fluffy and hot with a pat of butter melting into a golden pool on top. Sometimes there was gravy. Sometimes there wasn't. Either way, the cutlet held its own, and dinner felt like something worth sitting down for. Ground beef plus corn casserole. Some nights, you went full casserole mode. Opened a few cans, crumbled some crackers, and let the oven do all the talking. Ground beef and corn casserole was born from the pantry and built for speed. You browned a pound of ground beef, added a can of corn, a spoonful of tomato paste or sauce, and a few shakes of chili powder. Onions or chopped peppers went in if you had them. Once mixed, the whole thing went into a baking dish. Then came the topping. Some families swore by crushed saltine crackers, pressed down into a salty, crispy crust. Others poured a simple cornbread batter over the top, letting it puff up golden in the oven. The flavors were sweet and salty with a little smoke underneath. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. Filling, fast, and satisfying. Leftovers held up well the next day, too, and somehow tasted even better cold from the icebox for lunch. Some families added a layer of shredded cheese between the meat and the topping. Others kept it plain. Let me know if yours had a signature twist. Creamed tuna on egg noodles. It came from a can, but it carried dinner. Creamed tuna on egg noodles was one of those meals that looked plain but hit all the right notes when you were tired and hungry. You started with a simple white sauce, melted butter in a pan, a spoonful of flour whisked in, then milk poured slowly until the whole thing thickened into a smooth, velvety base. Into that went a drained can of tuna, flaky and briny, along with salt, black pepper, and a pinch of garlic powder if you had it. Frozen peas made frequent appearances, tossed in for color and a little sweetness that cut through the richness. The egg noodles, wide and ribbon-like, boiled in a separate pot and then drained straight into the sauce. Everything coated, everything warm. This was pantry cooking, budget cooking, depression-proof cooking. A few cans, a bag of noodles, a splash of milk, and dinner was on the table in 20 minutes. Kids liked it because it was mild and soft. Grown-ups liked it because it filled the gap between now and the next paycheck. Boiled dinner. When you had just enough for one solid pot, you built a boiled dinner. You started with a slab of corned beef, salty and brined, and set it in the biggest pot in the house, covered in water over a low boil. Then the vegetables went in one at a time. Whole potatoes, scrubbed but not peeled. Large wedges of cabbage laid in like leafy bricks. Thick-cut carrots, peeled and tossed into the broth. Over hours, the liquid picked up color and that sharp, unmistakable smell of cabbage cooked just right, mixed with the pepper and brine of the beef. When it was done, you piled everything on a plate together, the soft meat and the tender vegetables sharing the same broth. Some people slathered mustard on the beef. Others ate it as it came. It was a staple in New England that found its way into factory towns all across the country. And the leftovers were just as good as the original. Turn into hash the next morning or slice cold into sandwiches. This was the kind of dinner built for repetition. Salisbury Steak. Salisbury steak was the closest many families ever got to steak, and nobody at the table complained about that. You mix ground beef with breadcrumbs, an egg, salt, pepper, and a dash of Worcestershire sauce if someone had splurged on a bottle. You shape the mixture into oval patties, flattened just enough to sear nicely in a hot skillet. Once browned on both sides, they came out while you built the gravy. Sliced mushrooms, sautéed with onions, a sprinkle of flour to soak up the drippings, and then broth stirred in until smooth and bubbling. The patties went back in and simmered until they soaked up every bit of flavor from the pan. The gravy thickened, the meat stayed juicy, and the whole skillet looked like something you'd see through a diner window at 6 in the evening. On the side, mashed potatoes from a box or from scratch, depending on time, and frozen peas boiled until just tender. It wasn't steakhouse food. It wasn't trying to be. It was hot, filling, and felt like a treat on an ordinary Tuesday. Pork neck bones. When cooking Southern style and the meat needed stretching even further, you reach for the neck bones. Cheap, flavorful, and sold in big packs, pork neck bones became the foundation of countless home-cooked meals across working-class kitchens in the South and well beyond. You started by browning the bones in hot oil until the fat crisped and the smell started pulling people into the kitchen from other rooms. Then came the chopped onions, stirred right into the drippings, picking up every bit of brown flavor stuck to the pan. Water or broth followed, poured in to loosen everything and simmer the bones low and slow for as long as you had patience for. Gradually, the meat softened and loosened, and the liquid thickened into a savory, silky gravy that was worth every minute of the wait. You poured it over rice, hot and fluffy, letting the grains absorb every drop. Add a biscuit, some greens, or just a few slices of white bread on the side, and you had a full dinner from something the butcher practically gave away. Oatmeal meatloaf. When breadcrumbs ran low or went stale, oatmeal stepped in to hold the meatloaf together, and it did not just hold it. It made it heartier, gave it a slightly different bite, and stretched a single pound of ground beef further than you might expect. You mixed the beef with an egg, a splash of milk, dry oats, salt, black pepper, and a chopped onion if you had one. Pressed it into a loaf pan, spread a generous layer of ketchup across the top, and baked it until the edges pulled away from the sides, and the top caramelized into something dark and sweet. Sliced thick and served with canned green beans or mashed potatoes, it was dependable in the way only a good meatloaf can be. You didn't need gravy, though no one ever said no to it when it appeared. This was the kind of food that kept everyone at the table full without a single fuss. Beefheart Stew. When meat was genuinely scarce and you needed something truly filling, you turned to cuts that most people had the luxury of ignoring. Beefheart was one of them. Lean, muscular, and packed with a flavor that only revealed itself after hours of patient cooking. This was a Depression-era choice born not from preference, but from practicality. You trimmed it carefully, cut it into chunks, and browned those pieces in a big pot with whatever fat you had. Broth or water went in next, just enough to cover, along with bay leaves or a splash of vinegar to help break down the muscle and coax out the flavor. It simmered low for hours until the meat softened into something genuinely tender. The parsnips added a sweet, earthy note that balanced the intensity of the beef, and together the whole pot became something warming and honest. Served with bread or rice or eaten plain from a bowl, it filled you up and reminded you that cooking with care could turn something overlooked into something worth remembering. Smothered pork chops. Smothered pork chops were not just dinner. They were an experience. Thick, bone-in chops went into a hot pan and sizzled until the fat started to crisp at the edges and the kitchen took on that deep, porky smell that meant something good was happening. Then came the real work. A little flour, a splash of broth or water, and whatever spices were on hand turned the drippings into a silky gravy that coated every inch of the meat. The chops went back in, the lid went on, and the whole pan simmered low until the meat was completely fork tender and swimming in flavor. This was white bread food. You sopped up every last bit of that gravy with a slice from the plastic bag loaf sitting on the counter. Nobody left the table hungry. Nobody left sauce on the plate. It was warm, rich, and the kind of meal that made dinner feel like it mattered even on a weeknight. Canned Tamale Pie. When the pantry was getting thin and the budget was tighter than usual, canned tamale pie came together from memory, not from a recipe card. You browned ground beef, added a can of corn, a can of tomatoes or tomato sauce, and stirred in chili powder, cumin, or just a big shake of paprika. Sometimes a can of beans made it in as well. You poured the whole savory, spiced mixture into a baking dish and then added the best part. A cornbread topping, mixed from a box and poured over like a golden blanket. Some families stirred shredded cheese into the batter. Others crumbled saltines over the top for texture. The dish baked until the cornbread puffed and turned golden and the filling bubbled up around the edges to let you know it was ready. Scooped out in steaming spoonfuls, each bite had beef, spice, sweet corn, and soft cornbread all at once. This was survival food dressed in Sunday flavor. Cabbage Roll Casserole. And when you wanted the taste of stuffed cabbage but didn't have the time or the patience to roll each one by hand the way Grandma did, you put it all in a single casserole dish instead. Cabbage Roll Casserole, sometimes called Lazy Man Stuffed Cabbage, delivered every bit of the flavor without any of the fuss. You cooked ground beef with onions and garlic, mixed it with rice, salt, pepper, and tomato sauce, and then layered the whole thing in a baking dish with chopped raw cabbage. Into the oven it went. As it baked, the tomato sauce soaked into the rice. The cabbage softened and melted into the meat, and the whole dish turned into a bubbling, fork-tender plate of comfort. It didn't look fancy when it came out, but it smelled like Sunday dinner in a house with 5 kids. Some added a dash of vinegar or a spoonful of sour cream on the side. However you served it, it worked, and it was always better on day 2. Did your family make the real rolled version, or did you take the shortcut? Both were good. Be honest. Macaroni and tomatoes. If cabbage wasn't the direction for the night, and you needed something built from dry pasta, canned tomatoes, and whatever grease was left in the jar by the stove, macaroni and tomatoes with bacon drippings could pull off a full meal in under 20 minutes. You boiled elbow macaroni until just tender, drained it, and dropped it straight into a hot skillet that had been slicked with leftover bacon grease. That bacon flavor clung to every piece of pasta, even when there wasn't a single crumble of actual bacon in sight. Canned tomatoes went in next, juice and all, stirred in with a wooden spoon and simmered just long enough to melt. Salt, black pepper, a pinch of sugar to cut the acid. Every house had their version. Some people added a little onion. Others left it plain. But even at its simplest, this dish was smoky, tangy, and surprisingly rich. Served in deep bowls on chipped plates, it didn't need anything on the side. It was the meal, the kind of food made when the refrigerator was nearly empty, but dinner still had to happen. Hungarian Chicken Paprikash. And when there was a little chicken left, a scoop of sour cream, and enough paprika to turn the whole pan red, you could pull off a dish that felt like it came from another country entirely, even if you made it on a Wednesday with whatever was in the kitchen. Hungarian Chicken Paprikash was bold, warm, and built on a handful of ingredients that came together into something far more than what they looked like on the counter. You started with bone-in chicken pieces, browned in a deep skillet until the skin crisped and the smell spread through every room. Then came thin-sliced onions cooked down until golden, followed by a generous amount of paprika, not a sprinkle, but a real handful that turned everything deep red and earthy. A little flour to thicken, broth to loosen, and then just before serving, a scoop of sour cream stirred into the pan that made the sauce velvety and rich. Spooned over wide egg noodles, soft and buttery, with parsley on top if you were feeling decorative. Deep, smoky, tangy, and hearty. It fed families and stuck in memory long after the plates were cleared. Mock chicken legs / city chicken, when chicken was out of reach, or you simply needed to stretch what little meat you had. Someone out there figured out that pork or veal cube tight on a wooden skewer, breaded and fried, looked enough like a drumstick to put a smile on people's faces. City chicken was born in butcher shops where pork was cheaper than poultry and where presentation still mattered. The cubes were stacked onto sticks, dipped in beaten egg, rolled in breadcrumbs or crushed crackers, and then pan-fried until golden and crisp, sometimes finished in the oven to lock in the moisture. The result was juicy meat on a stick with a crunchy shell. It was kid-friendly, fit in a lunchbox, and looked just fancy enough to feel like a treat, even though everyone at the table knew exactly what it really was. Served with mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans, or a slice of plain white bread. It fit right in on tables where the budget was tight, but the effort was high. People smiled when they saw it coming. That said something. Hamburger gravy on mashed potatoes. And when there was no time to skewer anything and the pantry offered ground beef and instant potatoes and nothing else, you could still bring diner-style comfort to the table with one skillet, a little flour, and a whole lot of gravy. Hamburger gravy on mashed potatoes needed no introduction. Just a fork. You brown a pound of ground beef in a skillet, seasoned with salt and pepper, maybe some chopped onion or garlic, if the time allowed. Once cooked, you push the meat aside and whisked flour directly into the drippings. Then milk or water went in slowly, stirred constantly while it thickened and bubbled into a rich, creamy gravy. You poured it straight over a scoop of mashed potatoes, sometimes from scratch, sometimes from a box, but always hot and waiting. The gravy seeped through like lava. Every bite was warm, salty, and filling in the specific way that only a skillet dinner can manage. Frozen peas on the side. Some people mixed them in. Others kept them segregated at the edge of the plate. Either way, dinner was done in 20 minutes flat. Tuna Noodle Ring Mold. And when dinner needed to look like something special, some cooks broke out the ring mold and made something unforgettable from 2 cans and a handful of ambition. It sounded strange, and it looked even stranger, but the Tuna Noodle Ring Mold earned its place at the dinner table during the era of molded everything. You folded cooked egg noodles into a creamy mixture of canned tuna, peas, mayonnaise or cream of mushroom soup, salt, and black pepper. Once mixed, the whole thing was packed into a greased ring mold and baked until it was warm through and just firm enough to hold its shape. Then came the flip. It landed on a plate with a thud, steaming, dusted with paprika, oddly proud of itself. It sliced like a cake, but tasted like classic tuna casserole. Soft, creamy, salty, and familiar. The shape was the entire point. It made a humble meal feel presentable, even a little celebratory. And for a generation raised on efficiency and imagination, that was more than enough. Potato soup. When the cupboards were down to almost nothing, but hope still simmered on the stove, potato soup showed up. You started with potatoes and maybe an onion. Peeled and chopped, dropped into a pot of boiling water and cooked until soft enough to mash against the side with the back of a spoon. Salt, pepper, and a splash of milk if there was any in the refrigerator. What you got was somewhere between a soup and a thick stew, creamy from the starch, full of body even without any cream. No fancy toppings, just a handful of crushed saltine crackers dropped across the surface, softening in the heat, and a pat of butter melting right in the center like a small golden island. This was quiet food, humble food. You didn't brag about it, but you remembered how it made you feel. It fed kids before payday arrived. It warmed you up when the furnace was acting up. And even though it cost almost nothing to make, it made people feel genuinely cared for. Bologna Boats. And when you needed something baked, salty, cheesy, and a little unexpected, you pulled out the bologna and made dinner into something that felt almost fun. Bologna Boats were never about elegance. They were about resourcefulness and a sense of humor at the table. Thick slices of bologna went flat on a baking sheet, and as the oven heated, the edges curled up all on their own, forming little pockets ready to be filled. Into the center went shredded cheese, cheddar, mozzarella, or a torn slice of American. On top, crushed crackers sprinkled like breadcrumbs. The tray went into the oven until the cheese bubbled and the bologna crisped at the edges. They came out looking a little goofy and smelling like something far more indulgent than they really were. Some folks added mustard or ketchup. Others used leftover mashed potatoes or a spoonful of chili as the filling. Salty, melty, greasy in the specific way only bologna can be, and endlessly customizable. This was dinner made from odds and ends, and it always made people smile. Some of you probably remember packing these in a lunchbox. Some of you may have made them for your own kids. Let me know in the comments. Boiled carrot sandwich. Not every forgotten meal came from a skillet or a slow cooker. Some came from a specific creativity that tight budgets demand. The boiled carrot sandwich landed on tables during stretches when even the most basic ingredients were hard to come by. Carrots were cheap, available, and easy to prepare. You boiled them until soft, sometimes mashed them slightly, seasoned them with a little salt, and spread them on a bread. An open-faced version with a slice of cheese toasted over the top was a common choice, giving a warmth and a little richness that made it feel more like a meal than an improvisation. It was simple, honest, and made without complaint. As the economy improved and grocery shelves filled back up, the boiled carrot sandwich quietly disappeared. But for the families who made it regularly, it represented the kind of practical cooking that turned scarcity into something you could sit down and eat with dignity. Roasted game. Long before the grocery store was the only option, and in many rural homes well into the 20th century, roasted game was a regular part of the table. Rabbits, deer, and wild boar were hunted close to home, and a successful morning in the woods meant fresh meat that hadn't cost a single cent. You skinned and cleaned the animal, built a fire or heated the oven, and roasted it with whatever herbs or root vegetables were available. The smell of cooking wild game was distinctive, something between iron and earthiness, and it carried a certain pride with it. For farming families and those living far from town, this wasn't a novelty or a sporting activity. It was dinner. Fresh game was considered a genuine prize compared to preserved or salted rations. A meal roasted over an open fire or from the oven on a cold evening reminded you that if you knew how to work the land and the woods, you could always find a way to eat. Milk toast. Milk toast is exactly what the name suggests, and for a time, it was one of the most common meals in working-class households across the country. You toasted a slice of bread until firm, then soaked it in warm milk with a pat of butter. That was it. No eggs, no meat, nothing complicated. On days when a proper meal felt out of reach and getting up to cook something involved felt like too much, milk toast came through. It was gentle food, easy on the stomach, easy on the wallet, and it filled you up well enough for another few hours. It became especially common as a morning meal for people who could not regularly afford eggs or bacon. And for a time, it was as unremarkable as having a bowl of oatmeal as today. That it sounds unusual now only shows how much the baseline of a meal has shifted. For the people who ate it regularly, milk toast was not a hardship. It was breakfast. Skunk Stew. Now, This one requires a little context. Skunk Stew was not anyone's first choice. But during the Dust Bowl, when the land was stripped bare and the usual protein sources had dried up along with everything else, farmers made do with whatever they could hunt or catch. Before the cooking could even begin, the scent glands had to be removed, a non-negotiable step. Once cleaned and properly prepared, the meat was cooked with whatever vegetables and spices were available, low and slow, just like any other stewed meat. The result was reportedly a soft, mild meat that provided real protein when almost nothing else was available. People who ate it weren't being adventurous. They were doing what they had to do to keep their families fed. Looking back, it's a striking example of what people will do and figure out when the alternative is going without. Burgoo. Down in Kentucky, particularly around Owensboro, burgoo has been a fixture for well over a century. It traces back to 19th century African-American communities in the South, people who were working with limited ingredients and turning them into something extraordinary. A thick, dense stew built from whatever was available, including chicken, potatoes, corn, beans, and any vegetables on hand. Burgoo became something people could not live without. When the Civil War came, the dish spread further because of its ability to feed enormous groups of people from a single pot. You could make it in a kettle big enough for a church gathering or small enough for a family of 5, and it always came out warming and filling. The Burgoo Festival in Owensboro is still held each year, celebrating a dish that started a necessity and became a point of regional pride. If you ever find yourself in Kentucky in the fall, it is well worth the trip. White sauce. Some of the most useful things in the kitchen are also the simplest. White sauce, made from nothing more than flour, butter, and milk, was the working-class cook's answer to finishing a dozen different dishes. You melted butter in a pan, whisked in flour until it formed a smooth paste, and then poured in milk slowly while stirring until the whole thing thickened into a creamy, gentle sauce. On its own, it was mild, but it carried flavor from whatever it touched. Poured over pasta, it became a cream sauce. Stirred with cheese, it became something richer. Added to a casserole, it held everything together. In times when fancy ingredients were not available, this sauce kept meals tasting like something more than just necessity. It was the culinary equivalent of a quiet workhorse, never showy, always reliable, and in homes where nothing could be wasted, it made the difference between a meal and a really good meal. Boiled cider pie. New England has a long tradition of making do with what the land provides, and boiled cider pie is one of the more distinctive examples of that regional ingenuity. Apple cider, already a staple of the region, was reduced down by boiling until it reached about a quarter of its original volume. What remained was a thick, dark, intensely tart syrup that served as the base for a pie filling unlike anything else. Part apple pie, part pecan pie in texture, but going in its own direction entirely. It had a complexity that came directly from the concentration of the cider. The flavor was deep, tangy, and almost caramel-like at the edges. Pie making has always been a central part of New England food culture, and this one represented that tradition at its most resourceful, using what was in the barrel and the cellar, and turning it into something worth sitting down for. Saltine crackers. It might seem unusual to count a cracker as a meal, but in households during the Depression and through lean decades after, saltines were far more than a snack. They were shelf-stable, inexpensive, and endlessly adaptable. You broke them into warm milk for a simple breakfast. You layered them into casseroles in place of breadcrumbs. You spread them with whatever was in the jar, peanut butter, leftover gravy, a scrape of jam. You crushed them over soup to add body and texture. They stayed fresh for months, which made them one of the most reliable things a pantry could hold when grocery trips were unpredictable. Neutral in flavor, they worked with almost anything, and in a time when monotony was a daily reality, they offered at least a little variation in texture. A stack of saltines was modest, but it was something, and sometimes something was everything. Dried beans and lentils. Dried beans and lentils have fed people through centuries of hardship, and for good reason. They were cheap, they lasted indefinitely in a dry pantry, and with a little water and time, they became a hearty, protein-rich meal that could sustain a family through even the hardest stretches. Roman soldiers relied on lentils. Depression-era families stocked dried beans in whatever quantity they could afford. You soaked them overnight, simmered them low and slow the next day, and added whatever herbs or scraps of salt pork or bacon you had to give them flavor. The result was something filling and deeply satisfying, especially in winter. A pot of beans made from dry required patience, but almost no skill, which made it accessible to anyone with a stove and a pot. In lean times, the humble bean was never glamorous, but it was reliable, and reliability is worth more than glamour when there are mouths to feed. Cream chip beef on toast. Cream chip beef on toast made the most of thin-sliced dried beef packed in glass jars and a thick, white, creamy sauce that turned it into something genuinely satisfying on a cold morning. You made the sauce first, butter and flour and milk brought together into something smooth and warm, then added the beef, torn into small pieces, and let it all come together in the pan. Poured over toast, it was salty, creamy, and filling in a way that stuck with you well into the afternoon. Some cooks added cayenne to give a little bite. Others kept it mild. In middle to upper working class households, it was more common, since even dried beef carried a cost. But for those who had it regularly, it was comfort in the truest sense, simple food that arrived hot and stayed with you. Chow Chow. Down in the Appalachian South, Chow Chow has never quite gone out of style, though it's become rare enough in most of the country to count as forgotten. It was a pickled relish made from a chopped mixture of cabbage, green tomatoes, onions, and peppers, seasoned with mustard seeds, cinnamon, cloves, and other spices, then packed into brine and sealed in jars. The flavors were bright, tangy, and sweeter than you might expect, with a satisfying crunch from the finely chopped vegetables. It sat on the table as a condiment alongside beans, greens, cornbread, or pretty much any dish that needed a little vinegar and color. Canning Chow Chow required some care. Too long in the brine, and the flavors shifted. Too short, and the balance wasn't right. But when done properly, a jar of Chow Chow on the shelf meant weeks of adding life to otherwise plain plates. It was preservation, flavor, and practicality all packed into a single jar. Crispy fried grasshoppers. During the Dust Bowl, when the grasshopper plagues stripped crops bare and left farmers with nothing in the field, some families turned the problem directly into a solution. Grasshoppers were gathered in buckets, washed, and fried crisp in whatever oil or fat was available. The result was a crunchy, protein-rich food that, by most accounts, was more palatable than it sounds. Grasshoppers are high in protein, iron, and fat, and frying made them easier to eat without thinking too hard about what they were. This wasn't adventurous eating. It was survival, and it was practical in a way that made the best of a genuinely terrible situation. The grasshoppers were eating the crops. The families ate the grasshoppers. There was a grim logic to it that speaks to how determined people were to find a way through. What is often dismissed as a joke is actually one of the more striking examples of Depression-era ingenuity. Frogmore Stew. Down in the low country of South Carolina, Frogmore Stew is one of those dishes that became the centerpiece of any gathering, large or small. Named for the Frogmore community on St. Helena Island, where the dish is said to have originated, it is a one-pot boil that brings together shrimp, corn on the cob, potatoes, sausage, and spices all cooked together in a single seasoned pot of water. Everything went in at timed intervals, so nothing was overcooked, and the whole thing was typically dumped out onto a table covered in newspaper for people to eat with their hands. It was communal, loud, flavorful, and impossible to go wrong with. If someone at the table didn't like shrimp, you could add crab, oysters, or fish without losing anything. Coastal families relied on boils like this because they made use of whatever the day's catch offered. Frogmore Stew was never about refinement. It was about gathering, feeding, and making the most of what the water provided. Powdered milk. Powdered milk was one of those Depression-era staples that most people preferred not to think about too deeply, but used constantly anyway. When fresh dairy was not available or not affordable, a few scoops of powder whisked into water produced something that looked like milk and served every purpose milk served, even if it tasted a bit more chalky. It was shelf-stable, required no refrigeration, and was affordable enough to be distributed through relief programs to struggling households. For families with children, It meant kids had a regular source of calcium and protein even when the nearest dairy farm was many miles away. It went into soups, sauces, baked goods, and breakfast. It wasn't luxurious, but luxury was never the point. The point was keeping the household running and the children fed, and on that count, powdered milk delivered with quiet reliability. Bubble and squeak. The British influence on American working class cooking shows up in more places than people often realize, and bubble and squeak is one of the better examples. The dish dates back to the 1700s in England and made its way across the Atlantic with immigrant communities who brought the habit of repurposing leftovers into crispy, satisfying skillet cakes. You took whatever leftover boiled potatoes and cooked vegetables were on hand, mashed them loosely together, pressed the mixture flat in a hot greased pan, and let the bottom crust up brown and crispy while the inside stayed soft. The name reportedly came from the sounds the vegetables made while cooking. Corned beef or bacon made it heartier when available. Without them, it was still filling and good. This was a dish built entirely on the principle that nothing in the kitchen should be wasted, and it tasted like exactly the kind of careful, honest cooking. You came home from a long shift, opened the refrigerator, and made something from what was already there. Blood gravy. Blood gravy is one of the more startling items on this list, but it was a real and practical staple in parts of rural America during the Dust Bowl. When farmers slaughtered animals, not a drop of usable material was wasted, and blood from pigs or cattle was collected and mixed with flour, milk, and spices to create a thick, iron-rich gravy. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it reportedly carried a deep, savory richness that provided real nutritional value during a time when iron deficiency was a genuine concern. Blood-based dishes have a long history worldwide, from Swedish blood pudding to Filipino dinuguan, so this was not quite as unusual in context as it might seem today. For Dust Bowl families, it was a product of necessity and ingenuity in equal measure. Nothing from the animal was discarded. Everything became something. Kraft macaroni and cheese. The Great Depression did not produce many things that became permanent fixtures of American food culture, but Kraft macaroni and cheese is one of them. It came about in 1937 after a salesman began attaching packets of Kraft grated cheese to boxes of tenderoni macaroni and selling them together. Kraft saw the potential immediately and started packaging and marketing the combination directly. At 19 cents for 4 servings, it was accessible to nearly everyone. Families added canned tuna to it, stirred in whatever vegetables were on hand, or ate it plain from a bowl. It was fast, filling, and appealing to children in a way that made dinner easier for parents juggling too much at once. Decades later, it is still one of the most recognized products on the grocery store shelf, which says something about how deeply the Depression shaped the foods we consider comfort. It was born from scarcity, and it never left. Boiled animal hooves. Before commercial gelatin packets were affordable or widely available, the natural gelatin that came from boiling animal hooves was the thickener and binder behind soups, stews, aspics, and even some desserts. Cow or pig hooves, boiled for hours in a large pot, released collagen that, when cooled, turned the liquid into a rich gel. That gel could be reheated and used as a base for savory dishes or, with sweeteners and flavorings, used to set a mold or a custard. It was the kind of ingredient that modern kitchens have entirely replaced with a packet bought off a shelf, but for families in lean decades, it was simply part of the process. Nothing from the animal was set aside as unusable. Every part had a purpose, and the hooves, slow-boiled until they gave up every bit of their substance, were no exception. This was whole animal cooking taken to its logical end. Split pea soup. Split pea soup found its biggest audience in America during the Depression and World War II, when beans, peas, and lentils went from being basic pantry staples to being borderline essential. The government encouraged home gardening and foraging, and split peas, being cheap, protein-rich, and easy to store, became a standard recommendation for families trying to stretch their food budget as far as possible. You simmer them with water or broth, added a ham hock or a scrap of salt pork if you had one, and let the whole pot cook down until the peas dissolved into a thick, smooth, deeply savory soup that needed almost nothing else. On a cold evening, it was genuinely filling and warming, and it kept well for days. Simple food that did exactly what it needed to do and asked for nothing in return. Biscuits with sausage drippings gravy. Americans were already eating plenty of biscuits before hard times arrived, but when the Depression hit, finding an extra biscuit felt like a genuine windfall. Paired with gravy made from sausage drippings, they became one of the most important comfort foods of the era. The gravy was built directly in the pan where the sausage had cooked, the drippings serving as both the fat and the flavor base. A little flour whisked in, then milk poured slowly until it thickened and turned creamy. Poured over warm biscuits, split open and waiting, it was salty, rich, and filling in the specific way that only biscuits and gravy can manage. It stretched a small amount of sausage across an entire meal, and it was good enough that families made it even when things improved. It became a Sunday morning fixture, a diner staple, and a meal that has never fully disappeared, even as everything else on this list has. Popcorn with milk. This one tends to get a raised eyebrow until someone actually tries it. Popcorn with milk was a real meal during the Depression and into the following decades, especially in rural households. Popcorn was one of the cheapest grains available, easy to grow, easy to store, and easy to prepare on a single burner. When milk was available, which wasn't always, it was poured over a bowl of freshly popped corn and eaten like cereal. The hot popcorn softened slightly in the milk, and the combination of grain and dairy made for something surprisingly satisfying. Children took to it easily because it was sweet and familiar in texture. Adults ate it because it was fast and it worked. It was inventive in the way that a lot of Depression-era food was inventive, starting from almost nothing and arriving somewhere that made sense. Salt pork and beans. Salt pork and beans has fed people through some of the most difficult periods in recorded history. Armies carried it on long campaigns because salt pork could survive months without refrigeration, and dried beans weighed almost nothing but delivered reliable calories. You soaked the beans overnight, simmered them the next day with chunks of salt pork, and let them cook together until the beans turned soft and the broth took on that deep, fatty, porky flavor that made everything feel more substantial. It was an exciting food. Soldiers who ate it regularly during colonial and Napoleonic campaigns were not writing letters home praising it. But it was dependable, and dependability in a field kitchen or a Depression-era farmhouse was worth more than flavor. It kept people going when the alternatives were worse, and it appeared on working-class tables across this country well into the 20th century as one of those quiet, necessary meals that never asked to be celebrated. Lasagna soup. As Italian immigrant communities became more established in American cities after the Depression, some of their recipes adapted to the realities of limited budgets and limited time. Lasagna soup brought together all the core components of a layered lasagna: the pasta, the meat, the tomato sauce, the cheese, but in a single pot of broth that required no layering, no baking dish, and no lengthy assembly. You browned whatever ground meat you had, added broth, canned tomatoes, and broken pasta, and simmered it until everything cooked together into something warm and deeply satisfying. The nutrition was real: protein, carbohydrates, and vegetables all in one bowl. You could make it from leftovers or from scraps, and it adapted easily to whatever you had on hand. Slow cookers made it even easier later on, and the dish became a weeknight staple for families looking for something comforting and low effort. It was humble food dressed up in borrowed elegance from the Italian tradition, and it worked every single time. Beef plus gelatin soup/stew. This one is perhaps the most unusual combination on the entire list, but it made a certain practical sense in the 1930s when nothing could be wasted and gelatin was both available and useful as a thickener. You used canned corned beef, broken into small pieces, combined with canned peas, a little lemon juice or vinegar for brightness, and gelatin dissolved into the warm broth to give body. The result was a savory, somewhat unusual dish that set slightly when cooled, somewhere between a stew and an aspic. It was never going to be anyone's favorite meal, but in households where variety was scarce and ingredients were limited, it provided real protein and real satisfaction. Some cooks in the South and Midwest adapted the concept to their own spice preferences, adding paprika, hot sauce, or herbs to make it more their own. It was a product of its time, practical and earnest, and it served its purpose without apology. Hoppin John, and we'll end where the roots run deepest. Hoppin John is a dish with a history that stretches back through centuries of African, Caribbean, and Native American tradition, brought to the American South by enslaved Africans who made use of African rice and pork in a dish that could feed a family with minimal resources. Black-eyed peas and rice formed the base, cooked low and slow with smoked pork or ham hocks that gave the whole pot a deep, smoky richness. The smell of it cooking reportedly traveled well past the house and down the road. In African American communities across the South, eating Hoppin John on New Year's Day became a tradition tied to the belief that it would bring good luck for the year ahead. The dish spread into mainstream Southern cooking over time, and today it remains a New Year's staple in many households, though fewer people know the full history behind it. It is food with roots, culture, and memory all folded into a single pot. That is all 50 of them, meals that fed working people, farming families, and factory households across decades that demanded creativity, patience, and a willingness to use every last thing in the pantry. Some of them you've probably thought about for years. Others maybe you haven't had since you were a kid sitting at a kitchen table you barely come up to. If any of these showed up in your house growing up, I'd genuinely love to hear about it in the comments. Which ones did your family make? Which ones did they make their own way, with a different ingredient or a trick they passed down? Let me know down below. And if you'd like to see more videos like this one, there's a subscribe button right there. No pressure, just a standing invitation. Thank you for watching.